Good morning and welcome to today's event. We are delighted to welcome Marco Buti to our chat this morning, who is going to talk to us about a new book that he's just released with a very snappy title of The Man Inside, European Journey Through Two Crises. Marco is going to give us a little introduction about the book in the first 8 minutes or so. And then I am joined by two of my colleagues who would be happy to discuss some of the issues that Marco will raise. Andres Sapir and Guntram Wolf, welcome both, and thank you for joining us. May I remind you also that the audience is very welcome to ask questions on Slido. So please go to the website of Slido, www.slido.com, and enter the hashtag of the event, which is Crises, which is in the plural, CRISEE. So with that, Marco, we welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning. And what is the gist of the book?
Okay, thank you very much, Maria. Thanks to Gruntan and Andre. I'm very happy to be here with all of you. I mean, we have actually, this is a journey, a European journey through two crises, a subtitle of the book, and actually we traveled this journey in part together. If I look at all of you. Now, I don't have any slide, but I can show the cover of the book. Now, the cover of the book here is okay, that's the title, but then look at and this is a cover I chose myself. Usually, it's the publisher proposing certain covers. Here, I found the image myself. But you can see here, you can see a compass, with the fragile Euro boat standing over it. Now, I think this image here summarized, in my view, almost perfectly the kind of feeling that we had at the outset and for a good part of the financial crisis. So go back after Lehman Brothers 2008, and then the global financial crisis, then the sovereign debt crisis. The feeling at the time really was that we were operating without a compass, in part, and certainly for the whole period of the financial crisis, without an agreed compass. And over this compass, or lack of it, there was this fragile Euroboat that you can see here in the book, standing in balance, but in a very unstable equilibrium. So this, I think, is in a sense a way to characterize a little bit also in a graphic manner the feeling at the time. So if I look back at the financial crisis, because this is, the book covers quite a lot of areas, but I think, let's say, probably the center with the most important thing is how we dealt with the financial crisis and the lessons then for dealing with the current crisis. I mean, okay, the 3 points on the policy response to the financial crisis, and taking a critical view on that. First, I think it is largely agreed now that we declare victory too soon. So 2010, 2011, after the period of expansionary fiscal policy and monetary policy at the outset, in a sense, we thought that was, the worst was behind us, and both on the fiscal side, on the monetary side, 2011 started to withdraw, and that was, I think, in retrospect, clearly a mistake. The second point is that I think what motivated the actions and the choices made in the response to the global financial crisis, to the sovereign debt crisis, it was the issue of moral hazard. That was let's say, the main, sometimes overriding, if not single, filter through which decisions were made. So moral hazard. So this had, in a sense, two consequences. The first one was the decisions were made under the ultima ratio. So it was only when we stared into the abyss that we decide to take decisions, even courageous decisions, but in a sense, too late. The second point is that through the moral hazard filter, you had a clear division, north-south, between creditors and debtors. So the risk reduction responsibility embodied in the north, and the risk sharing solidarity in the south. And this was, in a sense, a frozen division throughout the whole financial crisis. And we know that doing reforms, institutional reforms, governance reforms, when it is clear who are the losers, who are the winners, does not produce reforms which are, solid. So in a sense, we lost at the time Raoul's veil of ignorance. So and it was clear that, in a sense, somehow creditors, in a sense, ran the game at the time. This is my second consideration. So the overriding prominence of moral hazard. The third consideration is that we were in an existential crisis at the time. You remember, and I mentioned it other times, also in Brueggel's events. I mean, we were following CNN coverage of the Euro crisis live, as if you have a hold-up of the hostage-taking, diversion of a plane. So as if, the Euro area and the Euro would not arrive to the next week. So this was the sense of the survival element that came into the picture. So surviving, in safeguarding the integrity of the Eurozone at all costs, was the name of the game at the time. This implied that what we had between the various policies, we had, let's say, the strategic interactions dominated the policy discussions rather than what should, let's say, monetary and fiscal or financial policies do in order to tackle the problem. So, for instance, to get the whatever it takes famous 2012 dictum of Mario Draghi, somehow we had to have the fiscal compact. So tightening on the fiscal side in order to get more room for maneuver on the monetary side. Same thing is, you have to tighten the rules in order to get the ESM. So this element of strategic interactions rather than, let's say, economic apportionment of and coherent role of monetary and fiscal policy, that's what dominated at the time. So in short, we did not have here what I have called they say we did not pass fully, at least, what I call the Monnet compatibility test. So Monnet compatibility test, the famous dictum of Jean Monnet, Europe being forging crisis, being the result of the sum of these responses. If you look at the policy response at the time, I think in terms of economic adequacy, institutional coherence, and political support in terms of citizens, we did not pass fully that test there. We survived, which is an excellent thing, but clearly in terms of optimal policy making, we did not pass that thing. Okay, jump to today, and then this is my conclusion here. I think a lot was learned. So I think we acted quickly rather than late as the time. I think it is clear that the persistency of the support has also been played a role. So we have activated so-called Next Generation EU, but the decision also General Escape Clause of the Stability Pact, which would apply, not only this year but also next year. So the clear message that you need to have, policy support underpinning the recovery, not just flash in the pan. So that is the second point. I think we moved from the strategic substitutability that between policies that I mentioned before to the more congruent policy mix. So this is certainly in entry. Now the big question mark is how we would manage that into the exit phase from the over expansionary fiscal policy. And I think what we did also, we enjoyed, I think, if you look at next generation youth, support of citizens. I mean, I have looked at, and that is not in the book, of support for European type of policies, like in Next Generation EU, in opinion polls, Eurobarometer in the first place, between, let's say, European citizens' opinion at large and the citizens' opinion in the frugal countries. And you look at that, it is clear that in the frugal countries there is less enthusiasm, so there is a bit less support, but it's still largely prevalent. So there is a little delta, but it's not that in none of these policies they go below 50%, in none, and by far above there. So I think they are also, in terms of political coherence, in terms of enjoying the support of citizens, I think in a sense the response has been better than the acrimonious, relationship that you remember between Germany and Greece at the time in the public opinion, also not only in governments. Obviously, all this has to be comforted by implementing what we have put in place in a very serious manner. And I think the name of the game looking forward will be, in the first place, the serious implementation of Next Generation EU. I stop here.
Wonderful, Marco. Thank you so much for such an incredible, competent summary of what is in the book, which is admittedly huge. I think the comparison between the two crises will be a main focus with my colleagues asking you questions. But before we do that, can you also say something a little bit about a part that you did not touch in your presentation, but is in the book? And that is the first 10 years of EMU, because these were the good years, but there were also the years which provided the fertile ground for imbalances to come up.
No, I think, Maria, I think you are absolutely right. I think the years, the first 10 years of EMU, essentially the benign years, is a period that I have dubbed as, let's say, weak monetary dominance. The whole Maastricht construct, the Stability Pact, the independence of the central bank, was to ensure monetary dominance and avoid fiscal dominance. That was the construct at the time of the adoption and ratification of the treaty. So if you look at the first 10 years, Stability Pact was implemented. Monetary policy could maintain, let's say, by and large, the target, meet the target as defined at the time. So one can say that, okay, well and good. But in reality, that's why the weak monetary dominance, that's why I add the adjective there. In reality, I mean, the convergence bonus that we had from the convergence of interest rates, which helped a lot in reducing the interest burden in public on the budget, on the one hand, and the favorable impact that they had on growth. So the effects on the budget of automatic stabilizer on the one hand, and the fact that there was little incentive for structural reforms on the supply side at the time, in a sense, accumulated problems under the carpet, which came to haunt us when the good times finished. So yes, benign years, but in reality, some of the issues that came to the fore after the financial crisis, after 2008, in terms of imbalances, in terms of also financial fragilities, were actually nourished, if you like, during the initial 10 years of EMU.
Indeed, and that's important to add that also on the kind of lessons learned, right? But Andre, why don't you go first? A lot to ask.
Thanks a lot. First, I want to say how much I enjoyed reading the book. It's really a very, very interesting book for all of us interested in the European Union, in the Euro area, in how we handle crisis well and not so well. So my first question is really about the comparison about the two crises, and you, Marco, have reflected a lot. You have been in the midst of those two crises, so you have huge amount of inside knowledge, both from an economic and a political perspective. So that's what I found the book most interesting about. Now, if I compare the Euro area crisis 10 years ago with this one, okay, we can all say, you know, we have handled this crisis so much better. But what I find interesting, among the many interesting things, is that in a sense, the North-South divide within the Euro area was present in the financial crisis, very much so, but it was also present in the spring 2020 for the COVID crisis, right? The southern countries, the southern EMU countries were hit very, very badly, both health-wise and economic-wise. And yet, although we had put into place a number of instruments during the Euro area crisis, including the ESM, this time around in 2020, when the crisis hit, we came up, or you came up with new instruments, and you have spoken quite a bit about the next generation EU and the innovation it represented, and providing some kind of a safe asset at the EU level rather than at the Euro area level. So what happened with the instruments, the Euro area instruments that were put into place then? And in particular, I wanted to push you, maybe a bit complicated from an institutional viewpoint, about the ESM. I mean, the ESM was one of the important innovations of the sovereign debt crisis. We did not hear much about the ESM during the COVID crisis. We heard about the European Commission and the European Commission issuing the next generation bonds. So, you know, does it mean that the ESM now has been put aside, that we have a new panoply of instruments, in the sense the ESM has become obsolete? What is your view about that? Is that one of the lessons of this crisis?
Andre, I think what motivated the different response, going back to what I said in my introduction, maybe not the only element, but certainly a key element, is the different nature of the crisis. So for the financial crisis, rightly or wrongly, it was very much interpreted as a policy-induced shock. And there, some put the emphasis on competitiveness, divergences. I mean, Jean-Claude Trichet presenting the divergent in every Eurogroup meeting, the divergent, labor costs in different countries. So some saw that in the financial regulation. Others, and very much motivated by the fact that the trigger here, the first trigger was Greece, very much associated with the financial crisis. All this, in a sense, policy-induced one way or another. This one here is not policy-induced. So it is an exogenous shock having different ramification and asymmetric effects. By the way, we see it these days, asymmetric effects, but in a very erratic manner, because, I mean, you yourself wrote last year on, trying to explain why Germany was less hit in the governance issue there. Now we find Germany here now more affected than others. So reversal of fortunes in a sense. So all this is so it was an exogenous shock. So a typical response which has a lot of conditionality in that, and externally imposed conditionality could not run the day in the response to this crisis here. Like it or not, and I have to say, if I look at the Italian debate, because it was more flagrant there, the ESM was, carried a bit the original sin of having been established in an intergovernmental matter during the financial crisis, and it carried a certain stigma, at least in policy terms. That was the perception. I have to say, us as European Commission, we worked an awful lot to make sure that this stigma would be, parked aside and overcome. So the pandemic facility of the ESM, how many times we have said, and we managed in the regulation that to establish the facility, not to have conditionality of the of the negative or perceived negative type. Yet this element here was cast a shadow in a sense on that, and you can see that very clearly, not so much comparing Next Generation EU and the ESM facility, but comparing the ESM pandemic facility with SURE. SURE, again, it was basically the same, or not much different in terms of they had cheap loans, SURE for the labor market and short time work, ESM for the health, but the mechanism was exactly the same. SURE, most countries actually benefited from that, applied, even those where the advantage of in terms of interest rate differential was very small, ESM nobody applied. So I think this element here, I think, is helps explain a bit the kind of born in mistrust, which was during the financial crisis, has cast a shadow on this also. So I think looking forward, one has to to think about how to regain trust for an instrument for crisis management is absolutely essential. I think the ESM was also, and I think it remains very, very important toolkit and pillar in the economic governance to deal with country-specific acute crisis. In these cases here, it was not a country-specific; it was across the board. So I think that explained, the different response.
Okay, thank you, Marco. Gunther?
Yes, thank you, Marco. Let me concur with André in the praise of the book and really say how much I enjoyed the book. And also, I think, as you said, Marco, it's also a description of a very long journey, some of which we traveled together. So really, it was very enjoyable to read that and look back at this time, even though it was, as you said, a very existential time in many respects. So I very much enjoyed the book. Now I have basically two questions that I would like to raise, and the first one is really about the divergences, and Maria touched on it, and by highlighting the divergences in the first 10 years. And you replied to it somewhat, emphasizing also the need to look at the supply side. And I would just like to push you a bit more on, what's your overall assessment of the divergences in the Eurozone, because they haven't ended with the financial crisis. If you look at debt figures, if you look at productivity developments, we continue to see, actually, in the course of these more than 20 years, we continue to see quite significant divergences. Or talk about the German current account, which continues to be very high. So it seems to me that there is a deeper issue here beyond the individual crises, that the Eurozone is confronted with. And ultimately, I think there is a question of how to resolve and how to reduce these imbalances or divergences. And what is your view on how this will be done and how it will shape up? So that's one question. The other question is more on, I think, more specifically on policies or short-term macro policies, where I think I totally agree with your description that we are now all agreeing that the tightening after the financial crisis was too early. It came too early, both on the monetary as well as on the fiscal side. And I also agree that we have learned the lessons, right? So policymakers, I think, in this crisis have really tried to play it very differently. You mentioned the SGP that was where the general escape clause was activated, but of course also the PEP program of the ECB, so the very significant purchase program of the ECB. How do you see the exit from this? Because it is a sort of, isn't there a risk that we have perhaps overlearned the lesson and are now treating even a supply side crisis, which in many respects the current crisis represents, as a demand side crisis, resulting in some inflation? So how do we exit from this, and what's the best sequencing?
If I may, so Guntram, you had two questions. Can we take the first one, because the second one really is about looking forward, and there's a lot to be bundled in that category of looking forward. Can we just perhaps address first the divergences, which I think is the basis for looking forward, and then we can go back to Guntram's second question, which is really what do we do next? Marco.
Okay, both excellent questions, obviously. On the divergences, let me strike here an element of optimism. Actually, in one of the chapters, one of the final chapters in the book, wrote basically in July 2020, I talk about the risk of great fragmentation. That was the and the response of the ECB, essentially the PEP program, as the centerpiece, and the collective response at the euro area, at the EU level of next generation EU, as actually helping to tame risks of fragmentation. That was back July 2020. Now, there are studies that actually show that obviously the ECB move, but also next generation EU ante litteram, meaning even before the actual implementation via the programs, helped a lot to reduce the financial fragmentation. So what we did not, what haunted us throughout the financial crisis, which was this financial fragmentation, and Mario Draghi, as president of the ECB, fought relentlessly against through the whatever it takes, then the QE, OMT, etc. This did not happen during the period of the COVID. So this is an element of that is important. So you did not have the added divergence trigger, which was there during the financial crisis. I think the response that we had convinced also the markets from that viewpoint. Now, is this let's say a permanent benefit or not? It's a big question mark, and we have to get the exit right, in a sense. That is the second question on this. I mean, you are right in stressing the fact that surpluses are still there. Current account surplus is still there. I mean, my view is that and I say it in the book, I mean, we have to shed Europe's small country syndrome. I mean, we cannot, I mean, Europe has a key actor in the global governance, in the global economy, together with the US, together with China. I mean, Europe cannot, on a persistent basis, subtract demand from the rest of the world. So I think this is, and the fact that you have a persistent high current account surplus, that's what it means, basically. So that is one. So we have to think in terms of large, and if you put it more in political terms, it is clear that, and that we are trying to convince some, especially in the north, in Germany, that a persistent surplus is not an element of strength. It is an element of vulnerability. So you depend more on external demand, you depend more on extraterritorial sanctions. We have seen it during the Trump era. So this it's an element of weakness, not an element of strength. So again, what is we know the from Keynes onwards, what applies to the micro does not apply to the macro, and vice versa. So I would think that next generation EU, and especially if implemented properly, I think would also, in a sense, help to respond to this to the divergences, both at the, let's say, in a sense, at the macro level, but also throughout the structural reforms and investment at the country specific level, to start to correct these inner imbalances on the supply side, which are clearly still there. If you look at the short-term indicators, I mean, the fact that Italy now is actually growing, obviously after a big shock in 2020, but bouncing back, I think, in a sense, more dynamically than the rest of the EU, which is an absolute historical novelty over the past 30 years after the period of stagnation and a gap which has been between 0.75 of a point and 1.5 point every year in terms of growth with respect to the rest of the Eurozone. I think this, in a sense, is at least some which should not make us complacent, but I think is an element of comfort.
Thank you, Marco. I think there's also questions coming in about the future, what to do next. So I think I would like to come to that. But before that, Andrea, you wanted to say something on this section as well?
Yes, I wanted to talk a little bit about again on the comparison between the sovereign debt crisis and the COVID crisis. I wanted to talk a little bit about the banking union, about the banking issue in Europe. We know that we are a bank-based system, and there was one expression that we used a lot during the financial crisis that we have not heard at all during the COVID crisis, was the doom loop between the banks and the sovereign. And Marco, you're very, very right. And it must have been a huge relief to you and to your colleague that we were not this time around during the COVID crisis in the ultima ratio kind of logic, always behind and acting on the edge of the precipice. Here, we managed, or Europe managed, to anticipate problems. And NGU, I think, as you rightly said, simply the political decision of NGU, in a sense, managed to calm markets and everyone around. So we did not have, in a sense, a euro area crisis, and certainly no doom loop during that time. And banks, not only the sovereigns, but the banks, everything was very, very quiet, and that's lovely. Yet we know that there are some structural weaknesses. We know that the banking union has not been completed. In a sense, this crisis, the COVID crisis, did not turn into a nasty crisis, but it was also not an opportunity to deal with the unfinished job of the banking union. And so what I'm wondering is that, is that something that will come and haunt us after the crisis? If we put a lid on some of the problems, on the banking issues and on the unfinished banking union that we will regret that we did not use this opportunity to complete the job on the banking union and be ready for if and when there will be the next financial crisis, the next banking crisis.
Yeah, Andre, I think you are absolutely right. We have not finished the business there. I mean, during the response to the COVID, actually, if you look at behavior of banks and everything, while they were part of the crisis during the financial sovereign debt crisis, they have been part of the response this time. I'm not saying of the solution, because we do not have a solution yet fully, as we know by looking out of the window here. But there were, in a sense, there was this benign. At the same time, I think completing banking union is a must. Now, one thing that I say, let me put it a bit in more political terms. One thing that I say at the very end of the introduction, where I draw some 5 or 6 overall lessons on looking forward, I say there that to go from A till B is never a straight line in Europe. And actually, trying to take a straight line is, in certain cases, the best way not to get there. Okay, how does this principle here, which I think is, it applies probably in life more generally, not only in Europe, but okay, I leave that aside, is that how does it apply to the issue of, let's say, financial union? And I put there banking union, capital markets union. I think if we cast, considering also a bit the ideological debates in member states, their national sensitivities, if we cast banking union as a natural complement of the euro, of monetary union, I think it is difficult to get there. Same thing a bit for capital market union, where it is less ideologically charged, but there is not much action, to be fair, there. So I think one has to take a bit of a different path, not a straight line. And a different path here, I think, is that I think in terms of the banking union, capital markets union, I would stress the issue of competitiveness of Europe in the world, and the role that the financial system has in the geopolitical role of Europe, on the one hand, and on the other hand, especially for capital market union, the contribution to the double transition. I mean, if you look at if you recast, taking a bit of a note for the private part of the investment, that this can be financed by banks, that is not possible for the traditional role of banks. These are projects which are long in ideas and short in collateral. The banks do not finance this kind of project. So you need capital markets. So if you cast this throughout this a bit more, I think you may hope for the best and wait for the next crisis, because that the next crisis we do not know, and it may be that it hits through an angle which makes that doom loop that you talked about, very relevant indeed. So I think here, I mean, what we need to do really is to try to be more forward-looking, lower the political discount rate, and get also to those issues which are unfinished business. Also with the idea that okay, in terms of sustained growth, role of Europe in the world, if the Eurozone is left with an unfinished architecture and lumps from crisis to crisis, I mean, you can forget playing a role vis-a-vis the US and China.
Thank you very much, Marco. But let's then move to the forward part and come back also to Guntram's questions about the exit, if I may call it that way, the exit from current support. But there is broader issues that I think we would need to sort of think about. You're in a unique position to comment on some of this. There's no doubt we need to say something about what would happen to the fiscal rules. What do you think about the next gen EU becoming a much more permanent tool, if at all necessary, relevant? How do we go about, meeting our very very high ambitions on climate and the digital transitions. All these things, render themselves very, very nicely for this discussion. What I really liked about the book, which I think gives you a competitive advantage by comparison to others, is that you've taken a real-time view to the questions, because policy is done in real time. Is the benefit of hindsight is a luxury we can't afford. This is the time to decide in real time how to meet and best prepare for Europe in the world and for Europe in the next crisis. So can we start then with perhaps Guntram's question, if that is a good point to start?
Yeah. It is a difficult and also institutionally and politically delicate question. I mean, as I always say that, I mean, I come into these kind of events, try not to wear excessively an institutional hat. So I express my views, or at least certainly not wearing an institutional helmet. So if I give you the standard party line, it's not very interesting for the discussion. So what I'm saying is purely my own views. So I think what we succeeded into is, as Andre also mentioned before, I think we avoid the ultima ratio, and I think we moved from this strategic substitutability between fiscal and monetary into policy moves which were led to a congruent policy mix, as has been called in some of the literature on this. Now, it is easier to be congruent in the entry. It is considerably more difficult to be congruent in the exit. And there, what has clearly made the choices even more complicated is the surge in inflation that we have seen. I think on this, I think one has to clearly have a reading of the inflation phenomenon, that we have this inflation surge now, and is this something temporary, transient, or is this something that is staying with us in a longer time? So I think we do not have here an answer, a ready-made answer yet. I think what we have heard, I think, from the ECB also making a difference here between the US and Europe, because we are not exactly on the same, definitely not on the same place, is that the interpretation here is that this surge is certainly not extremely transient in terms of disappearing next month. But if you take into account base effect, supply side disruption, which one may think looking forward the next months would lessen, I think would still be more of a temporary phenomenon. So one has to, in a sense, keep calm and and not overreact to this. Now, certainly, I mean, one cannot see. If I go back, I think those of my generation, Andre, also remember vividly the stagflation phenomenon of the 1970s after the oil price shock, first and second oil price shock. I mean, what led to the surge and double-digit inflation at the time was, I mean, a combination of very strong trade unions at the time and widespread indexation mechanisms, which led to the spiral, wage price spiral of the time. I mean, we do not see anything of we don't have anything of the sort now. So if you think about inflation as self-fulfilling, a self-nourishing phenomenon, I think is of that type, then it is not something that we see, that we are going to see now. So that is that. I don't want to minimize the worries clearly on that front, but I think one has to keep nerves steady. Now, so in terms of the policy response, I would guess both on the fiscal side and on the monetary side, we have to take a more, let's say, Augustinian view. Make me just, but not yet. This has been applied to fiscal policy in terms of let's say, anchoring the policy making onto credible medium-term plans, which reassure market and public in general on the sustainability of the public finances and public debt. I mean, the idea of a next generation EU, in part working here through the denominator, in a sense, reforms and investment, I think would help. And we'll have to make sure that the review of the Stability and Growth Pact, which is on the ongoing discussion, is consistent with this anchoring of medium-term plans onto debt sustainability. And then I think one can be, and here I hesitate a bit with, I don't want to go outside my field, on the monetary side, Augustinian in terms of anchoring medium-term inflation expectations. So I think this is, okay, it is a little bit of a reticent answer, Guntram, so I do not spell out fully what you may expect, and I will be great to, or very interested in knowing what you both or you all three think about this. But this, I think, it can give a bit of a compass on how to look at things for the future.
Andre?
Just one point. I mean, I think you gave a very good answer, and also within the confine of the constraints. I want to push you a little bit on the wage spiral. I mean, you took a rather benign view that the situation today is very different from the 1970s because the mechanisms, it's essentially the indexation mechanisms, are not there in general. No, and that is correct. But it seems to me that wage price spiral can happen despite the mechanism. I mean, politics is still there, and in a sense, the indexation was a way to deal with the politics, right? Rather than have strikes and to have people demonstrate demanding wage increases and having governments being under huge pressure, indexation was invented in a sense to relieve that kind of pressure. No, it created other problems. So this time around, yes, we do not have, except in a few countries, we do not have the mechanism. But that doesn't mean that then politics will not come back. And if prices do increase substantially, and also because there have been bottlenecks, and in some sectors, people feel that they have suffered through the COVID crisis and they were not rewarded. We already see that there are political demands for wage increases. So it seems to me that the wage price spiral is not necessarily something of the past, because we do not have indexation. So it can come back through other ways, and maybe even more complicated ways because of politics and political demands. So I just wanted to hear your comment on that. And I mean, to me, it's basically a warning that we should take that possibility. I'm not saying at all the certainty, but that possibility seriously, despite the fact that institutional changes have occurred. I just wanted to hear your reaction to that.
Andre, no, I agree with you in part. Let me say, first of all, I think you have in mind the more, let's say, the Belgian experience with the indexation, a wage indexation. So in a sense, you buy social peace via a mechanism, which is this, in a sense, is a substitution between the two. If you take country like Italy, at the time, the two went hand in hand. So it was not what led to the double-digit runaway inflation it was not only that you had, and I remember Padova Schioppa, Modigliani essay back in the 1970s, how an economy would function with 100% plus indexation, describing, very well all the perverse dynamics there. But you had that, and on top of that, you had also the social unrest, the strikes, and all the rest. So here it was complementary in a sense. It was not a substitute. So this is what made also the problems much more acute in that country compared to other countries like this one. I agree that there is this political demand there, and I think I would also be, I recognize fully that more and more in policies that we make, equity considerations, consideration of fairness, I think they have to come prominently. I mean, we have learned, I think we are not able to push through structural reforms if there is not a sense that is a fair distribution of the costs of this. And this has also an implication for wages, both public sector and as well as more generally private sector. I think one cannot think about an ever decreasing wage share. But again, these elements here, I think it seems to me, they are not leading to that kind of spiral that one saw at the time. So I think here it is more, this is a difficult call, because I mean, all inflation episodes, they start with something which is let's say a jump in the price level. So the issue here is that would this be more of an increase in the price level, which manifests itself for a while as an inflation phenomenon, or is it leading to a self-fulfilling spiral, which would then lead to a persistent inflation looking forward? I would tend to say, even with your considerations, which are absolutely right, we are still more on the first, let's say, scenario than on the second one.
You wanted to react to that, Guntram, or did you want to say something? Or
yeah, I mean, I think on that point I'm quite close to André, and of course, living and running a place in Belgium also means that I saw the wage indexation firsthand in Bruegel's own budget. So the social piece is there, but is of course immediately visible in your budget. Now in other places, I think the social peace issue will be quite a big issue. I'm quite convinced of that. If we run another 1 or 2 years of 5% inflation, and the wages don't catch up, it is a real issue, and the ECB will get a lot of heat for that. But that's more sort of an afterthought to what you both said. I guess the one point where I would like to sort of also push you a bit on is, since you mentioned Next Generation EU quite a bit, and perhaps we can have a short discussion on Next Generation EU and hear from you. Where do you see Next Generation EU going in the next years? I mean, you said, of course, the criticality of the reforms as well as of the investments being done, and we know that member states submitted thousands of pages of what they want to do with this. So give us a sense of how the European Commission as an institution will ensure that this money is well spent, because I think we all agree it needs to be well spent, the reforms need to be done. Only then it will be seen in a few years as a success and as perhaps a template to be used in another crisis or whatever. But I mean, if this doesn't succeed now, a lot of the credibility of all the European institutions, but also of the member states, the main recipients, is at stake. You mentioned, of course, the faster rebound in Italy, but as you say, it's also a rebound from a deeper recession. So I think the the jury is still out on what's going to happen in Italy on the reform front. So the more you can tell us, I think on these aspects, I think that would be really very, very interesting for us here in the call, but also for our audience, I'm sure.
Indeed,
Okay,
Marco, can I just, because we're coming to an end, and there is one question that it is coming from our audience. Most of the questions I think you've addressed in one way or the other, but there is one that we haven't touched at all, and I would also like to throw it in the conversation in your last 3 or 4 minutes. It's somebody called Sophia who's asking the question: in the past crisis, there seemed to be a north-south divide, and in this crisis, more an east-west. Do you have any comments on that?
Okay, let me take it, and I give you a reply to both questions. On next generation, you're absolutely central. So I think it is central for, let's say, regaining or maintaining trust, which is key for all the things that we have discussed. Going back also to the question of Andre on banking union and all completing EMU architecture. So that is the. I think this trust here was, came and was regained, and it took the shape, concrete shape, when in the European Council in July 2020 there was the agreement by the leaders on Next Generation EU, the famous 750 billion, and then was carried through with the Parliament Council with the implementation, with the actually adoption. Beginning of 21 of next generation EU formally, the regulations. Now, I have to say that my fear was that you have, next generation EU under the belt, adopted legally, then member states have to present the plans, and the council has to adopt the plans through what is called the council implementing decision, proposed by the Commission under the community method, the classic. What I fear myself was there is a bit of a lessening of the tension of the crisis. So come to the council discussion, the classic division would reappear. So the classic things are hostage taking, delaying tactics. Being very pricky on certain things and so on and so forth. If I look at the way the council adopted the initial programs, the first 12 which were presented by the 30th of April, and which led then to the, after the adoption of the 13% pre-financing disbursement back in August. They went through very smoothly, comme une lettre à la poste. Now, why so? I think it was appreciated by the member states, even those who were very very attentive on what was appreciated. I think was the kind of interactions that the Commission had with the countries. So some of you have looked at certain countries in particular. I mean, we pushed a lot countries even before the presentation of the programs to go in the right direction. In some, we succeeded more than in others, to be fair. But overall, I think we got, when the countries presented the programs, we could, because it's not the country present the program to the council, it's the Commission who proposes the council implementing decision. So us ourselves, we need to be convinced that the program is on the right track and is adequate. Otherwise, we would not be able to defend it. So I think what was appreciated was this dynamics of interplay between Commission and the countries in the preparation of the program. And now I think we'll have to see what happens to next after the adoption, but in the delivery. Now we have had just this week Spain asking for the first payment, then France. I think then there will be Italy, who has the first tranche of 25 billion between grants and loans, based on the delivery of over 50 measures by the end of the year. what is very interesting in the plan, and I hear Luca Guntran, in the Italian plan, is the relationship between reform and investments. Basically, what we had in the plan, which is in a sense a courageous feature, and define a little bit the typical political logic, is that there is a front loading of reforms and a back loading of investment. That's the Italian plan. So it does like that, right? So and this is logic because a number of reforms are preconditions for succeeding then in implementing the investment. But in the typical logic, one has, okay, first you do the benign things, putting the money on investment, reforms will look later, backloading. So this inversion here, I think, is the Draghi trademark. So I think, and the success of this would be key for maintaining the trust. And I think we positive spillovers on many areas, including in the short term now, the discussion on the Stability and Growth Pact review. So if this trust is maintained by proper implementation, then I think you can move countries a bit away from their ideological corner and have a bit more adult, discussions on these rules here also. Obviously, implementation has to continue, and this implementation in certain countries is more important than in others. So Madrid, Rome, they carry a lot of weight on this. Second question, and I conclude on that. Let me use a bit of an image here, north-south versus east-west. So north-south, as I said before, responsibility, risk reduction versus solidarity, risk sharing, vertical axis. Horizontal axis, let's say liberal democracy and integration versus sovereignism. Let's put it like that. I think what has happened in the crisis now in the response, there has been a squashing of the y-axis and a widening of the x-axis. So in Europe, with difficulties, in a cumbersome way, I think we manage, maybe with the ultima ratio and too little too late, and with a lot of damage, etc., but we manage to deal with conflicts of interest. So we have the institutions and we have the practice for that. So that is the the y-axis. So with Next Generation EU, in a sense, we compress that. The distance between north and south has become smaller, and I think with the reforms Next Generation EU, we can also, on the side of responsibility, I think push countries from the south, in a sense, over the x-axis. What is more of a difficulty that we have is when the conflict is in values, and that is the y-axis. And what we have seen here, there is a lengthening of the x-axis. That has also an implication in terms of the programs, because now you take the programs for Poland and Hungary, which has they have to respond to the main country-specific recommendations, and independence of judges, rule of law is also, beside the general issues. They are also, in a sense, an element in the implementation of the Next Generation and adoption of the programs. Okay, I would hope there that we would find a way to solve these issues and to have the programs adopted also for these for the remaining countries. But certainly, it is more difficult to find a composition and an agreement when there are questions of, conflict on values rather than conflict of interest.
Yeah, I certainly hope we find a way, just as we squash the y-axis, to squash also the x-axis for the sake of the project. Look, we are already over our time. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much, Marco, for taking the time to come and speak to us today about your book. It's been a real pleasure to have you and to listen to your summary and to your detailed comments. I wish you best of success with the book. And with that, also thank Andrea and Guntram for joining us this morning, and all of you for listening to today's event and engaging with us. That's all we have time for today. Hope to see you in one of our future events. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marco.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.